I'll open up this live stream with basically just putting up my Patreon first. Then I'll get into just explaining what happened yesterday. Yesterday was my niece's birthday. Would have normally gone a lot shorter, but the fact is my sister-in-law decided basically to become the center of attention and drag it out a lot longer than it was initially supposed to be. And since she loves to be the center of attention, she basically was basically making to where she had to be the one taking pictures and she had to be the one controlling everything, and this was a whole major thing. And this is what ended up happening yesterday. This pretty much made it to where I was not able to get dinner until a much later time last night, which meant that I could not even produce even a basic podcast where it would have even come out until like a very very late time, and that was going to be almost impossible. And that was basically the case. And that's where we basically sit with that whole point. Now you're probably going to want me to get right into the point of the thing on the Rand Paul news. And that's basically with it when we're talking about the wall. When we look at the actual thing on the wall, we're going to actually look at what we end up looking at the his thing of voting against it, and this is basically where him and a lot of the other people are actually voting on what would view as the side of the Democrats, but it's for an actual completely different reason. In this case, they're actually voting on what would actually be a constitutional reason, and this is because the actual power of the purse belongs in Congress. Specifically, power of the purse belongs in the House of Representatives. And when we look at this, we'll understand that basically it's not lawful for the president to declare this. Now, what the president's trying to state was under this was that he was lawful in doing so under it being a military construction. Well, when we look at this, is that we know that a wall is not a military construction. Military constructions are such things as actual bases. You cannot claim a wall as a base, and if we're going to claim under national security, that's a complete utter. That's not a military construction. National security would be under a completely different agency. That's not Department of Defense. That is actually under the actual agencies that actually deal with security itself, that are actually dealing with such things as the actual border patrol, or dealing with FEMA, and it goes down actually when it comes down to actually bills. When you're talking about national security, it actually goes down as an actual completely different funding bill. When you have the 12 different funding bills, it's actually completely different than Department of Defense. So they can't even argue from that aspect. And when we're talking about it is we're talking that the as it goes down to the Homeland Security that actually handles all of these issues. So when we're talking about how these things react, is you need to understand where these actual systems go toward is actually Homeland Security, and that's something that needs to be understood, so that it's understood how these how the funding actually appears. Thus, when we're looking at the actual bills for the for how the thing gets funded, when you break it out to the 12 bills, you'll understand that you can't just say, well, we're going to claim this as a military construction. Well, you can't, because it technically goes under national security. Well, national security is if it's technically in need of national security, that goes under Homeland Security. Homeland Security is its own actual funding section, meaning it cannot be taken under the guidance of a military construction, which he was using a previous legal decision under the Reagan administration, which means that basically that is completely illegitimate with his reasoning. And this is why when we're talking about it, this is why we have people like Justin Amash, Thomas Massey, and Rand Paul posting it. But he himself is not the president himself has not called out these individuals. The only people who we've seen call out people like this have been neoconservatives that have basically are wanting stuff like this, which shows that it's more about spending more money than anything else. They're not actually about an actual solution. And yet neoconservatives like Sebastian Gorka that have no idea about how to actually solve a problem or actually act constitutional. They would rather essentially put more power into the executive, which is what a neoconservative would rather have, and would rather essentially create a king than anything else, ignoring any of the actual ideas of the Constitution, number one, and number two is ignoring the actual problems that can happen when you start flipping parties and what could actually happen from that. I mean, we're talking that when you have an actual opposition, that you have people that are actually talking about that free speech is something that should be limited, and we have people on the street talking about that and writing articles that free speech should be limited. I mean, there have been articles that have been recently published in this manner that have been highlighted by Matt Kibbe, of people of feminists that are basically saying that free speech should be limited. There are people that have stated that the Second Amendment should be should be even more highly restricted, even though we know that the original intention was that the right to own firearms was supposed to be to the same level of firearm ownership whatever the military had, and this was known back then. Regardless of what regardless of what gets developed, it's meant to keep you on the same lines so that you can actually defend yourself against a tyrannical government. And when we find this is the idea of what we see. And when you start to get an executive that becomes even more powerful, this is what ends up being created. and especially with the opposition that doesn't believe in that. They don't. We have both neoconservatives and liberals that really do not believe in the Fourth Amendment. They do not believe that you have a right to privacy, and basically going against the idea that's of these FISA warrants, because essentially is they backtracked what the moment that they that they wanted the White House, they people like Adam Schiff were starting to backtrack the moment that they wanted to grab that White House spot. They backtracked on reform, because he was speaking before on RT America on talking about FISA reform and wanting to eliminate all of these abilities for them to essentially get these bulk warrants. And then all of a sudden, it comes around that essentially that's they wanted the White House, and they essentially rigged the system for the White House. And all of a sudden, he starts speaking a different tune. And so when we're talking about this is why having this even larger executive is not helpful, which is why we're not finding the criticism of the president toward these people that are actually making a legitimate stand on these points, because he understands that they do want the wall. It's just they want to go about it a different way. They want to go about it in an actual constitutional way, and they're fully on board with funding the wall. They're basically what the president has issue with is people who are completely either what he says that people who are weak-kneed with it, who are basically these are more people on the idea of like Susan Collins, who tend to like the Susan Collins, the Lisa Murkowski's, people who tend to be weak-kneed in the Republican Party, and tend to lean toward the Democrats in many issues, and are really just kind of like Democrats and in many issues across the board, and really just kind of like label themselves as Republicans when they really shouldn't. And then he has problems with the actual Republicans and with the Democrats themselves, because they're doing this basically out of spite, and because they know that they want more people to cross over, and then get amnesty later so that they can replenish their lost voters, so then they can get the amnesty and get them the ability to vote, because that's what it all boils down to. This is why when we talk about guys like Rand Paul, you're still noticing that when it comes down to it, is he is still meeting with Rand Paul, and he doesn't have a problem with Rand Paul. Otherwise, he would definitely call him out by name. Because, I mean, when he was what it called kind of tossing out insults, when they were tossing out insults back and forth on the campaign trail, they're calling out each other by name. But since then, since the campaign trail's been over, they've been working together and on many things. That was where we got the association for the healthcare on executive order, and they're hoping to get that through on permanent on a bill. But because the Democrats are in, the Democrats definitely want to block that, because they want to go for single payer, because both sides know that the ACA is a failure. And when we have this with it, we've even seen Rand Paul be essentially golfing with the president on a fairly regular basis, because they've been talking with one another on many different things. And he wouldn't be associating with the president on a regular basis uh, if he was essentially an enemy of the president. I mean, he's definitely a person that's on the same lines as the president. It's the biggest. What we need to understand is the biggest enemy of the president is these neoconservatives that have essentially tried to, the neoconservatives and the Democrats have tried to derail any plans that he's had on the long run. And that's what needs to be understood. It's not people like Rand Paul, and to state that Rand Paul is out for his own ego is completely illegitimate. What Sebastian Gorka has stated. The only people who've actually been out for their own ego is actually the neoconservatives because they realize their influence is dying. The influence for the actual neoconservatives is just completely gone out the door. The only way that they can actually influence is from the Democratic Party, because their actual influence from the Republican side is starting to wane, because even from the Republican side, they know that they cannot push for regime change as hard as they once could without massive penalties to their name. They once would have been able to go right through and actually push for regime change in Venezuela, but they know that they have to go a lot lighter because of the implications on what it would do for them on the long term, because people are very, very wary on war, and they're not going to buy into it. So neoconservatives like Sebastian Gorka, like John Bolton, like Elliot Abrams, and the like, need to understand that basically they can't do this, and try to basically use their liberal foreign policy perspective on everywhere to do this with a conservative president in office. The only way that would be able to happen is if you had a liberal president in office, such as Hillary Clinton. Now, with Clinton was likely to choose Bolton as well for the national security advisor, if not a higher up position. Because the fact is he was essentially right on line with her ideas for intervention. And this is the whole thing with it, is that's what needs to be understood. Now, when it comes down to it, is Trump is essentially going off and ignoring these advisors, which is in many cases infuriating the legacy media. This is another point that needs to be brought forth, and this is where we get to this point. And when what's actually caused the legacy media to attack Trump is for him essentially going off and ignoring these interventionist people. And so he's not exactly following the protocol of intervention. And when you don't do that, when you essentially ignore this has been another problem. And what we start to look at is where he's getting this from is a lot of times he's listening to people like Rand Paul, or like a Thomas Massey when it comes down to meeting with the president. And this is causing a massive change in what sometimes policy will be. And it's infuriated the news. And if you look back at the election, is what was a major difference on the Republican side is they had two people who do not have neoconservative advisors from the John Hay Initiative. Basically, the John Hay Initiative is basically, I think, that's Daniel McAdams put it best as the Walmart of neoconservative advisors. And basically there were two campaigns that did not have advisors from this. One campaign was Rand Paul's campaign, obviously, because they were totally opposed to it, and the other campaign was Donald Trump's campaign, and this caused essentially a huge rift with the media. Now, the media wanted the media and the kind of perpetual bureaucracy or deep state, whichever one you want to call it, essentially did not like the fact that neither of these were accepting these advisors. Now, on the Democratic side, basically, they had pretty much chosen their people, their person who took advisors from the John Hay Initiative. And that was Hillary Clinton. So they didn't have to worry about that. They were going to get their neoconservative in there on that end. And then when it came to the Republican side, they figured out of, what was it, like 16 people basically? Or I think it was 21 people total. But so out of the 21 people, they figured, okay, we have 19 out of 21. We just have two people that we do not want to win. It was Donald Trump and Rand Paul. Those were the two people that they did not want to win. And what ends up happening is Donald Trump wins, and even though one of those people from the John Hay Initiative leaked his way into the campaign amongst others, he's not really listening to him on a regular basis, and he's listening to a lot of times the other person who did not have the John Hay Initiative advisors, which they view as being very troublesome. So what they do is in the media they blast him as being non-presidential, and this is a term for basically not being a neoconservative and not bombing anything that moves. And we find this from CNN, MSNBC. We'll even find this from Fox as well, and you'll find this from a lot of people basically in their statements of saying he's not doing enough, blah 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 blah, and he's being weak, and you'll have all these like horrible statements basically that are completely inaccurate and brain dead. He's being weak against Russia. He's a puppet of Vladimir Putin, and totally illegitimate statements, trying to get him to act irrational, and that was the purpose of the Mueller investigation as well. Get him to act irrational, just like any neoconservative would, and that's the whole point. And make sure that he does things that are against the best interests of the United States and against the interests of peace. And while it's worked to some degree, it's not going to work overall with it because of his long-term relationship with Rand Paul. Mind you, that he's known Rand Paul well before this point, and it's he's worked with Rand Paul in a lot of charity things for helping other countries establish things, from like establishing water to basically for medical care. And this is done through Citizens United usually, and Doctors Without Borders. So those are the two charities he's worked with, which would also defeat that whole notion that Donald Trump is racist, because he wouldn't exactly help these other countries if he were. And that's not exactly something that's such as Haiti or Guatemala or some of these other countries like that. He wouldn't exactly help these other countries if he were racist. That was actually the only help that Haiti actually got, was through Trump. The stuff that they got through the Clinton Initiative was Clinton Global Initiative was actually where the country got ripped off. the only legitimate help they actually got was when they worked with Trump. And so when we're looking at that is I think when it comes down to it is Trump does usually understand that Rand Paul comes from actually standing on the Constitution only, and he will essentially kind of get the president back in line, just like the other ones, like Justin Amash, Thomas Massey, will essentially get the president back in line when it comes down to following the Constitution. And you'll have people like Sebastian Gorka just end up blowing their mouth off, talking about stuff they do not even understand. I mean, Sebastian Gorka doesn't even have any legitimacy to his statements, nor does he's had a security. He doesn't have an actual security authorization. Because the fact is he's always been considered a security risk to begin with. This is not only from one country. This is multiple countries. This is from the United Kingdom and from the United States. So they don't even believe that he is actually reliable. He could not even pass any type of security authorization for either country. So this is what we're talking about here. And he's stating that Rand Paul's out for his ego when he could not even meet that basic standard. And when we're talking about it, this is where you need actually, if he's supposed to be a security analyst, well, you need to at least be able to meet the basic standard of being able to pass one of those security analysis tests. And if we're talking about anything about someone being out for their own ego, it would be him, because essentially he should be finding a new field, because he is not a person who should be being an analyst when an analyst when he can't even basically even meet the basic standards of what you would actually need to do any type of government work for security, and even meet the basic standards for basic security clearance. He can't even meet that basic standard. And when it comes down to it, because he can't even pass that, and so when it comes down to it, he really has no legitimacy to even make those accusations. And he's made some of the most wild, outlandish accusations on people that are basically not protectionist. He's basically one of these people that is a big protectionist person. He tends to be part of what would be deemed as the alt-right, which is basically pretty much like the left-wing people that were tossed off from the Democratic Party, that believe in a lot of these essentially social welfare programs and a lot of these things like this. So he's not even a conservative in any aspect. He's just a protectionist. He's pretty much a far left person with it. He doesn't believe in any conservative values. He's just full on protectionist. So he doesn't even believe in any actual idea of what conservatives believe in. He doesn't believe in the free market. He's full on for the idea of sanctioning anybody else with it because he doesn't like them. He doesn't understand. He believes in the idea of these outlandish tariffs, even though it actually negatively impacts the consumer. And he doesn't even know what he's talking about half the time. And pretty much he's on the same lines as a Bernie supporter. But he does, but because essentially when you get to the alt-right, you get these people that say these basically horrible things with it. The only thing he doesn't have that a lot of the alt-right have is racism. Basically, you basically eliminate some of that, and that's what you got. Now, not all the alt-right are racist, but some of them are. And basically what he has with it is he believes strict things on what he calls immigration, and immigration should be, we've even stated immigration should be based on bringing people from Europe, and we've even stated him stating things like this, horrible, backward things like this. So there's even a certain degree of racism from that, and that we should do severe cuts to immigration, and just things that don't even make any legitimate sense, when our actual problems are actually, if we're going to keep some type of welfare, we need to bring in immigrants based on what income they actually earn here, and actually use that as an actual chart, which means Australians, British, Taiwanese, Indian, and Filipino. That means those are the 5 you need to focus on. It means the ones you need to kind of say, no way in hell ones would be the ones like Burmese, Mexican, the Dominican, Somali, and Iraqi, and those would be the 5 that you would say no to, based on that. Now, if you eliminated all social welfare programs except for the disabled, what you would see is then you could basically say, you come here, and then you come here, and we're going to run a criminal background check, and you're going to come here, you expect nothing, you'll get nothing, and you basically earn everything you get. And what will come out with is there's going to be very, very few people come in. And if you're concerned about any criminal activity from no border wall with it, what you do is you basically deal with that by having a end to the war on drugs. This will severely reduce the price of the drugs, because what you're doing is you're essentially creating a end to the taboo on it. Once essentially you do that and you create that end to it, what's going to happen is the price is going to plummet. And then when the price becomes so low that it becomes unable to essentially ship within a country because it's not affordable, because the shipment price to stay below the actual native price would be not attainable, it wouldn't even be valid, and then you're going to see actual native actual crime within the actual country go down itself. Same idea as within alcohol prohibition as well. When they eliminated the alcohol prohibition, crime went down to a massive degree, and this is what ends up occurring. And there's many other solutions you can do to essentially do this, but what we have with it is we have people who still believe in a failed program that they think works, and they need to understand that the war on drugs just doesn't work. It's very expensive. It's deliberately done to fail on a global scale. I mean, you look at what we've done in Afghanistan. They basically, if we sprayed Roundup on these poppy crops out in Afghanistan, they're meant to they're actually deliberately grown to make heroin and opium and other derivatives thereof, and meant for illicit trade. You would basically understand that if you did that, it would essentially decimate the growth. But they say, oh, but it will infuriate the drug lords of the area, and it could hurt the economy of Afghanistan. Well, if you're actually trying to impact on a war on drugs, then wouldn't you want an effective policy? Well, no, they're not looking for an effective policy. They're just looking to essentially police it, which means they're never looking for an effective policy. So if they're not looking for an effective policy and they're just throwing people in jail, well, they're not doing anything about it. So why not go in the other direction and get an effective policy on the opposite end and end the war on drugs, which means you're essentially going to be getting an effective policy which will essentially end the value, which will make it so it doesn't become profitable for these people to grow these crops anyway from the bottom up, because they're going to say, well, hey, if you're going to be paying us even less, the people that, such as in Colombia, if you're going to be paying us even less, because they virtually pay them virtually not much for the basic cocaine itself that they produce. If you're going to pay us even less, because as it travels, it starts railing up cost. So they're going to state, if you're going to pay us even less, we're not going to produce it, because the fact is it's not cost effective. And essentially what that'll do is that'll essentially eliminates the usage of it. You make the you essentially establish the end of the war on drugs. You're going to notice very, very quickly is you probably won't even be able to get cocaine in the United States, because the fact is it's made elsewhere, and nobody and it wouldn't be able to be made profitably, because it's usually made by poor farmers, and it's made in unsanitary conditions. So what would happen is that they would state that it's not affordable anymore for them to make it. It's actually more affordable for them to grow natural crops. They would actually be a lot more lucrative for them than to actually grow cocaine and to develop cocaine to work up the supply chain, because the actual cost of it. And that this is where we get to why we get to the idea of what we can do as being a lot more effective. And I think it's something that if we look at it, we can actually get enough votes on both sides, because I think both sides could actually agree on this point to do something, and to do something about border security on this point. And that would definitely aid in border security, because they'll eventually say, hey, there's no money in this, and those people for MS-13 rely on this money for drugs. So if they're not getting any supply up through the lines with it, because it just don't exist, because it's not affordable to run the supply through, because everything's legal through the U.S. and it's dropped the price to an exceptionally low price. Guess what's going to happen? Nobody's going to actually do it. And the less taboo something is, the less usage you're going to have. So it's going to lower the amount of want, which is going to cause it even lower, to crash even lower. And that's the way things happen. Most of why people end up using it in the first place is because of its taboo to begin with. So when you move that taboo out, it's going to essentially impact the whole thing to begin with. And this is why if we do things constitutionally, we can actually get things done. Now, what needs to be understood is that with the Democrats, they need to stop pulling this idea of we're just going to oppose things just because Trump wants it. They need to actually start coming up with a better debate system than that, because that's quite irrelevant of an actual debate system, because it doesn't make much sense. You need to actually come up with an actual argument based off facts. What's the actual facts behind your argument that supports your points? Now, it can't be based off feelings, because we know feelings are completely irrelevant when actually debating an argument, because as we've discussed before, feelings only get to horrible solutions. Now, if we're looking for that with it, they're going to have to come up with some type of reasoning why they oppose it. And they're going to have to come up with some legitimate reasoning for this. Or at least some type of solution that would be an alternative that would actually come up with something better than an actual border wall. Now, if they could cite this, the actual financial cost, they're going to have to validate that with the actual financial cut of everybody else's border wall that we're paying for, and they're going to have to point that out, that we're paying for other border walls and we want to cut those too, and they're going to have to start cutting foreign aid as well. So when it comes down to it, so if they're going to use that argument, they're going to have to use the argument with cutting foreign aid. And that's going to have to be something that is going to have to be discussed. But if currently their whole argument is, we don't like Trump, we're not going to approve anything he likes. He could basically say, I want to basically approve the Paris Climate Accord, and they would disapprove of it, even though it's everything that they want. They would still disapprove of it because he says he's for it. I mean, he could state that he wants to double Planned Parenthood's money with it, and they'd say, no, we don't like this, and they would actually get 100%, pretty much nearly 100% support of this, with exception of the couple of Republicans who are pro-abortion. Those are the only two people who would support the president on that. I mean, everyone else would basically go against the president and just go completely insane when it comes out to the Senate. And then the House would be just as insane with some of these people because they just don't even think logically. I mean, there's maybe a couple of people who do, but the rest of them don't. And it just doesn't make any sense. And this is what's they're doing. And if we were actually in a normal situation where we were in a country that was actually making these legitimate arguments, I mean, if you were actually making arguments on facts, and if we were making arguments on facts, we probably would not have a military that stretched across the whole globe. We wouldn't have a debt over $20 trillion. We wouldn't have essentially our rights being obliterated, and it's done by both parties. Because the fact is when you go down to facts, is you can't argue the point of this without trying to get over on emotion, trying to use that as an excuse. And this is why when Rand Paul argues on the point of the Constitution, is Sebastian Gorka tries to go on saying, oh, he's just looking out for his ego. He's all out for his ego, and this is his argument. Well, Sebastian Gorka is not looking at the actual Constitution itself, and the Constitution is very, very specific in what powers each branch has, and it's very, very blunt. And it states it right out there with it. I mean, the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is the shortest government document out there, and it doesn't take long to read. And he should actually take some time and actually read it. Maybe if he did with it, it would actually help out his idea of how things are supposed to work. He would actually understand that the executive cannot do any military action. Plain and simple. It doesn't matter what type of justification they think they have. There's no such thing as we can do military action for 30 days. Don't think so. It says basically all your acts of war come out of Congress. They're the ones who make the decisions. That's specifically stated right there in the Constitution. It's very, very blunt. You don't get to do any of that stuff. The executive can't do anything. The only types of actions that you would ever be able to do is the defense if your actual country was attacked, and that's only that's only defending it. That's only defending itself in the case of an imminent attack, or or after it's been attacked, with it just defending itself from the attackers and repelling them. That's it. There's no such thing as basically being able to do any other types of acts of war without congressional authority. I mean, you can repel attacks, you can do anything like that, but that's just natural to self-preservation. But most of those things could be done with it by essentially stop. In most cases, when we're talking about like terrorism, most of those things could be stopped by essentially gathering your evidence first off, and not gathering too much, not collecting everything and everyone, but the actual proper people. And every one of these things could have been stopped, such as 9/11. We were actually warned by the Russians well beforehand, but we ignored it because we didn't believe them. Guess what happened with the situation of Libya? Everything was going bad for the for people in the British embassy. They left. We were warned by the Russians again, and they told us that things, that basically there were terrorists in the region, that we should basically get out, and this is basically weeks in advance. What do? We stay. Why? Because there was actually a transfer of weapons to the rebels, so that basically they can take out Gaddafi. That this is basically taking out Gaddafi, and so that they can a mix of this is through the whole process of taking out Gaddafi, and so that they can transfer the weapons up to Syria to try to take out Assad. And that's why the whole mission was there to begin with. Because there was a CIA annex right next door. And when we look at this is what happens when we do these things. And when we look at the Constitution, you'll see that basically is, and we start to look at the meaning of what our foreign policy was supposed to be from our founders, you'll see that what Rand Paul has always talked about, and what his father Ron Paul has talked about, is essentially what we're supposed to be doing. Not what morons like what Sebastian Gorka are saying and what John Bolton are saying. That is completely against the actual Constitution. So when Trump starts to listen to people like Rand Paul and Thomas Massey and others like that, that's when he starts to get back on pace. Now, when it comes down to the deals with it that he's trying to get done, is what ends up happening is people like Elliot Abrams and John Bolton have basically been there and just totally botched any types of peace occurring because of their mouths and because of the past things that they've done, and they have no business being there. Because these people basically believe in blowing up the world. And they think that basically they blow up the world and reshape it in their own image, that they basically can, that there's not going to be any negative outcome. Like basically out there in the Venezuela, we're finding that basically is that Juan Guaido was basically educated in the United States in regime change. Well, it shows that basically that he's essentially doesn't have the support that we thought he did. Um, he's the actual explosion that happened out there was not from the Venezuelan people. Was not from Maduro's people, but from Juan Guaido's people. That actually they weren't watching where they're throwing Molotov cocktails, and they actually blew up the aid truck by not watching where they're throwing the actual Molotov cocktails. And that's how it exploded. But if we actually look at within the actual country, we're actually seeing something completely different from what's we're seeing outside the country with these Guaido supporters. We've actually seen something quite interesting, which is we've seen people showing Ron Paul pictures in what it called in big huge rallies, which shows what it called that there isn't the support for Guaido, not necessarily the support for Maduro, but there's actually a huge support for this laissez-faire capitalism out there that's coming about, and it's from the idea of what people like Ron Paul have stated. Now, we don't know necessarily if these people have an actual leader, but we know that they definitely have an actual idea and where this idea comes from. Now, these are the people that would actually be idealistic in creating a relationship with. Now, this is going to be against what people like Sebastian Gorka, what John Bolton, what your Hillary Clintons are going to want to deal with. But this is going to be ideal with what the country's going to want to deal with, because these are not going to be people that are going to be pro-war. These are going to be completely anti-war people. And if there's a transition with it, this is from Maduro to these people, which it shows like there's actually a very, very large crowd of these people. It shows that we can actually, there's some type of leader of them, and this leader's is essentially becomes president. We're talking that's there could very well be a new country in Venezuela that's going to be laissez-faire capitalism and could essentially rise them up to where they need to be. And this is something very, very important. And that's something that's become very, very interesting. It's something that Daniel McGanum's actually noted a couple days ago, which is something quite interesting. Now, when we see people like Rand Paul with it being criticized within for standing up on the Constitution, I highly doubt that we should be doing that, because essentially if we started following more of a hard line on the Constitution here, we're going to notice things get a lot better here in the United States, instead of going towards socialism or going on the idea of neoconservatism or any of these other brain-dead ideas of this idea of these forms of government that we've done, or continuing this idea of this crony capitalism. We need to go toward an idea of where we have a government that's based on pure laissez-faire capitalism. When you start to go toward that, is you're going to realize that the end result is going to be beneficial for everyone. And that's something that's, I think that is going to be something that everyone can get behind, because you're going to see that every form of life is going to get better. And that's something that no matter what type of political ideology you come from, everybody's going to want everybody's life to get better. You're going to want those in poverty to actually have more opportunity, and that should be the whole purpose. And if we look at things with it, we want the opportunities to be out there and not to be limited because of bad policy. And essentially what it would be is to eliminate bad policy. And that's really what's holding us back, is we have these essentially weights on us from bad policy, and we've essentially swapped off the weights off government and flipped it to being the weights on the people. And we need to essentially flip that to being weights on government to limit their power, and put the and lift the weights off the people to let them get all of the opportunity that they deserve. And this is the whole point. And this is what people like Rand Paul, like Ron Paul, like Thomas Massey, like Justin Amash are trying to fight for. And I think this is where we're going at. Now, if you like this live stream, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it on social media to your friends, and share it publicly. Try to donate to the Patreon if you can. And that's about it for today's discussion. Bye, everyone.